The moment she started laughing, I knew this was going to become a problem far bigger than anyone realized. At the time, I had no idea how right I would be. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and for nearly 5 years I lived in Cedar Creek Estates without any serious issues. I paid my HOA dues on time, followed the neighborhood guidelines, and generally stayed out of community drama. Like most homeowners, I wanted a quiet life. That changed on a Saturday afternoon when a situation unfolded that nobody expected. The neighborhood was busy that day. Families were outside enjoying the weather. Residents were walking their dogs, and several homeowners had gathered near the clubhouse for a community event. Everything seemed normal until I received a phone call that immediately changed my focus. The details are not important, except that the situation required urgent attention and quick action. Within minutes, I was trying to coordinate help while also dealing with unexpected obstacles inside the community. What should have been a straightforward effort quickly became complicated. One of those complications was Stephanie Parker, the HOA president. Stephanie had built a reputation for inserting herself into almost every neighborhood issue. Some residents admired her confidence. Others found her exhausting. Either way, people paid attention when she spoke. That afternoon was no different. As I tried to address the situation, several residents gathered nearby. Questions started circulating. People wanted to know what was happening. The atmosphere became tense. Then Stephanie arrived. At first, I assumed she would help organize people or clear confusion. Instead, she immediately began questioning my decisions. Her tone surprised me. Rather than expressing concern, she seemed amused. The more serious the situation appeared to become, the less seriously she treated it. Several residents looked uncomfortable. Others nervously laughed along. Then came the moment I still remember perfectly. In front of a growing crowd, Stephanie made a sarcastic comment about how dramatic everything seemed. A few people chuckled. She smiled. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not an awkward laugh. A genuine laugh that suggested the entire situation was ridiculous. The reaction spread through the group. Suddenly, the mood shifted. Instead of treating the matter with urgency, people started viewing it through Stephanie's perspective. If the HOA president was laughing, maybe there was nothing to worry about. If she seemed unconcerned, perhaps everyone else should be unconcerned too. I could actually see public opinion changing in real time. That was the moment I realized something important. Facts were no longer driving the conversation. Perception was. Then another strange thing happened. Every attempt I made to explain the seriousness of the situation seemed to make Stephanie more dismissive. She repeatedly implied that I was overreacting. Each comment generated more laughter from a few nearby residents. The crowd was not hostile. In many ways, that made it worse. People simply assumed Stephanie knew something they did not. Her confidence created credibility. Her attitude created a narrative, and that narrative was spreading quickly. Eventually, the situation moved forward and the immediate concerns were addressed. Most residents returned home believing they had witnessed an exaggerated neighborhood incident. Stephanie appeared pleased with how the afternoon ended. She spent several minutes speaking with homeowners before leaving the area. By that evening, I began hearing versions of the story that barely resembled reality. Somehow, I had become the homeowner who caused unnecessary drama. Somehow, Stephanie had become the voice of reason. What nobody understood at the time was that the story they were laughing about was not finished. In fact, it had barely started. And hidden inside that ordinary afternoon was a piece of evidence that would eventually change everything people thought they knew. By the end of the week, Stephanie's version of events had become the official story in the minds of many residents. What amazed me was how quickly it happened. People who had only witnessed a few minutes of the situation suddenly spoke as though they understood everything. Neighbors repeated the same comments over and over. They described me as emotional. They described Stephanie as calm and practical. The more often those descriptions were repeated, the more accepted they became. Facts were slowly being replaced by assumptions, and very few people seemed interested in questioning them. Then I started noticing something even stranger. The details of the story changed depending on who told it, but the conclusion always remained the same. One homeowner claimed I had overreacted from the beginning. Another insisted that several residents tried to calm me down. A third person described conversations that never actually happened. Yet despite the contradictions, every version somehow ended with Stephanie looking reasonable and me looking irresponsible. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Then I ran into Jason Reed near the community mailboxes. Jason had been standing much closer to the situation than most residents realized. Unlike many people discussing the incident, he had actually witnessed most of it unfold. When I asked what he thought about everything, he hesitated before answering. That alone caught my attention. Jason was usually direct. This time he seemed careful. Eventually, he admitted that some of the stories circulating throughout Cedar Creek Estates did not match what he remembered. He was not ready to challenge anyone publicly, but he clearly felt uncomfortable. That conversation gave me my first indication that the neighborhood narrative might not be as solid as it appeared. Unfortunately, Stephanie seemed determined to strengthen it. Over the next several days, she attended community gatherings, spoke with homeowners, and casually referenced the incident whenever it came up. She never appeared angry. She never appeared defensive. Instead, she acted completely confident. That confidence proved incredibly effective. People trust certainty, especially when it comes from someone in a position of authority. The more confidently Stephanie spoke, the more residents accepted her perspective. Then came another unexpected development. The HOA released a community update focused on communication and neighborhood cooperation. No names were mentioned. No specific event was identified. Yet everyone understood the message. The update encouraged residents to avoid unnecessary drama and rely on HOA leadership during difficult situations. Once again, the implication was obvious. The narrative was being reinforced without directly addressing the facts. Several homeowners noticed it immediately. Most remained silent. A few privately expressed concerns. Then something happened that I did not expect. A resident I barely knew stopped me while I was walking through the neighborhood. She quietly told me that she thought the situation felt strange from the beginning. According to her, Stephanie started joking about it before most people understood what was actually happening. The observation was simple, but it mattered. It matched my own memory exactly. More importantly, it suggested that at least some residents were beginning to look past Stephanie's confidence and examine her behavior more closely. That realization gave me a small sense of relief. Not because people were suddenly taking my side, but because they were starting to ask questions. Questions have a way of changing conversations. And the more questions residents asked, the harder it became for a single narrative to remain completely unchallenged. For the first time since that afternoon near the clubhouse, I sensed that the story spreading through Cedar Creek Estates might not remain under Stephanie's control forever. For nearly a month, life inside Cedar Creek Estates felt strangely different. The controversy never completely disappeared, but it changed form. Instead of discussing what actually happened, residents discussed what they believed happened. That distinction mattered more than most people realized. Perception had become reality. Every conversation seemed to start with assumptions and end with conclusions. Somewhere in the middle, the facts disappeared. The result was that I slowly became known as the homeowner who created unnecessary drama. I never received that label directly. Nobody walked up and said it to my face. Yet I could feel it in conversations. I could hear it in the careful way people spoke around me. Some neighbors became distant. Others acted polite but uncomfortable. The social atmosphere had changed. Then something happened that caught me completely off guard. During a weekend gathering near the clubhouse, I overheard a group of residents discussing the incident. What surprised me was not that they were talking about it. What surprised me was how little they actually knew. One homeowner confidently described events that never occurred. Another repeated a version of the story that contradicted the first one. A third person corrected both of them. Yet none of those contradictions seemed to matter. They all agreed on one thing. Stephanie had handled the situation well. Listening to that conversation felt surreal. It was as if the conclusion existed first and the details adjusted themselves around it. Then Jason Reed called me one evening. His tone immediately told me something was different. Earlier that day, he had spoken with several residents who attended the original gathering. According to Jason, some of them were starting to remember details differently than the narrative suggested. Small details, specific details, the kinds of details people overlook until they become important. One resident remembered Stephanie laughing earlier than most people claimed. Another recalled several neighbors looking confused rather than amused. A third specifically remembered people asking questions that were never mentioned in the popular version of the story. None of those observations proved anything by themselves. Together, however, they created a problem. The official narrative was no longer perfectly aligned with people's memories. Then came another unexpected development. The HOA announced an upcoming community meeting focused on communication and neighborhood engagement. Most residents viewed it as routine. Others suspected the controversy would eventually surface. As the meeting approached, conversations throughout the neighborhood became increasingly focused on transparency. Homeowners wanted clarity. They wanted consistency. Most importantly, they wanted explanations that matched the facts they personally remembered. That shift represented the first real challenge Stephanie had faced. Until then, confidence alone carried the discussion. Now, curiosity was entering the conversation. Curiosity can be dangerous to any narrative built on assumptions. A few days before the meeting, I experienced another surprising moment. A resident who had openly supported Stephanie approached me after checking her mailbox. She admitted she was beginning to feel uncertain. According to her, every time someone asked a specific question about the incident, the answers somehow became broader instead of clearer. She could not explain why that bothered her so much. I could, because clarity usually becomes more detailed over time. Confusion becomes more general. Her observation echoed concerns I had been hearing from several homeowners. Then the most important realization arrived. The controversy was no longer about me. It was no longer about whether I overreacted. The focus was slowly shifting towards Stephanie herself. Residents were beginning to examine how she behaved before, during, and after the incident. And once people start questioning the storyteller instead of the story, everything begins to change. The community meeting drew one of the largest crowds Cedar Creek Estates had seen in years. By the time I arrived, residents were already gathering in small groups outside the clubhouse. Conversations filled the parking lot. People were discussing communication, transparency, and the growing confusion surrounding the incident. What struck me most was how different the atmosphere felt compared to a few weeks earlier. Back then, most homeowners seemed content accepting Stephanie's version of events. Now many of those same people were comparing memories and asking questions. Curiosity had replaced certainty. Once the meeting began, Stephanie appeared completely confident. She greeted residents, reviewed routine HOA business, and moved through the agenda with her usual composure. Anyone walking into the room without context would have assumed everything was normal. Yet beneath the surface, tension was building. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the conversation to shift. Eventually it did. During the section dedicated to community concerns, a resident asked a question about communication during unusual situations. The inquiry sounded harmless. Stephanie answered smoothly. Then another resident followed with a more specific question. How should homeowners evaluate information when different accounts of an event exist? The room became noticeably quieter. Stephanie responded by emphasizing trust, cooperation, and respect for community leadership. The answer sounded polished. It also avoided the heart of the question. Several residents noticed immediately. Then Jason Reed stood up. The room turned toward him. Calmly and respectfully, he explained that he had personally witnessed much of the original incident and remembered certain details differently than what was being discussed around the neighborhood. The statement was not dramatic. It did not accuse anyone of dishonesty. Yet its impact was immediate. For the first time, someone publicly challenged the accepted narrative. Stephanie quickly replied that memories can be imperfect and misunderstandings are common. Under normal circumstances, that explanation might have worked. This time it did not. Then another homeowner unexpectedly supported Jason's comments. She recalled seeing confusion among residents during the incident rather than the certainty that later became part of the story. A third resident added another observation. Suddenly, the room was no longer discussing whether questions existed. The room was discussing how many questions existed. The shift was impossible to ignore. Stephanie remained composed, but her responses became increasingly broad. Every answer focused on general principles rather than specific details. That pattern started attracting attention. The more residents requested clarification, the less precise the explanations seemed to become. Then came the moment that changed everything. An older homeowner named Richard Bennett raised a simple point. He asked why so many discussions focused on people's memories while almost nobody discussed whether any official documentation existed. The room fell silent. The question seemed obvious once he asked it. If the incident involved public responders, there might be records, reports, or other forms of objective information. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Stephanie quickly redirected the conversation toward future community goals. The attempt worked only partially. Residents listened, but the question remained hanging in the air. After the meeting ended, nobody talked about landscaping projects or budget updates. Everyone talked about documentation. Groups formed throughout the parking lot. Homeowners exchanged theories and observations. More importantly, they exchanged curiosity. Driving home that evening, I realized something significant had happened. The controversy was no longer being driven by rumors. It was being driven by unanswered questions. And questions have a tendency to lead people somewhere narratives cannot control. For the first time since Stephanie laughed in front of that crowd, I sensed that the story she worked so hard to shape was beginning to develop cracks. The days following the meeting should have eased tensions, but instead they intensified them. Richard Bennett's question about documentation seemed to spread through Cedar Creek Estates faster than any rumor ever had. Everywhere I went, residents were discussing the same thing. If objective information existed, why had nobody talked about it before? The question was simple, yet it carried enormous implications. For the first time, the conversation was moving away from opinions and toward evidence. That shift created a problem for Stephanie. Until now, she had been operating in an environment where confidence mattered more than facts. The more residents focused on documentation, the less effective confidence alone became. Then something unexpected happened. Stephanie launched what appeared to be a full effort to bring the discussion to a close. Community emails became more frequent. HOA announcements emphasized unity, cooperation, and moving forward together. Several updates encouraged residents to avoid dwelling on past disagreements. None of the messages mentioned the incident directly, but everyone understood what they were referring to. The timing was impossible to ignore. Some homeowners accepted the explanation. Others became even more suspicious. Then another community gathering was announced. Officially, it focused on future neighborhood improvements. Unofficially, everyone expected questions. The turnout was large. Residents arrived carrying months of curiosity. Stephanie opened the discussion with an unusually optimistic tone. She highlighted upcoming projects, praised volunteer efforts, and repeatedly emphasized positive momentum. The presentation was polished. The problem was that it felt disconnected from what many people wanted to discuss. Eventually, a homeowner raised a question about transparency. Another asked about record keeping. A third asked whether documentation existed related to the incident. Once again, the room became quiet. Stephanie responded carefully. She explained that community leadership had already reviewed the situation and saw no reason to revisit it. The answer produced exactly the opposite reaction she intended. Instead of ending the conversation, it fueled it. Residents exchanged glances. Several looked visibly frustrated. Then Jason Reed asked a question that changed the atmosphere. He wanted to know why requests for clarity were being treated as obstacles rather than opportunities. Nobody expected the room to react the way it did. A wave of agreement moved through the audience. Homeowners nodded. Some quietly applauded. The response surprised even Jason. It was the first time residents openly supported further examination instead of closure. Stephanie appeared caught off guard. For months, her authority naturally guided discussions. Now that authority seemed less certain. Then came another shock. A resident named Karen Ellis revealed that she had contacted local authorities seeking information about public records connected to the day of the incident. She did not claim to possess anything. She simply confirmed that inquiries had been made. The room immediately came alive with conversation. Stephanie quickly attempted to redirect attention toward community business, but the effort failed. The idea that official records might exist had fundamentally changed the discussion. After the meeting ended, groups formed throughout the parking lot once again. This time the conversations were different. People were no longer debating who they believed. They were discussing what information might exist. That distinction mattered enormously. Belief depends on persuasion. Information depends on facts. Driving home, I realized Stephanie's strategy was beginning to fail. Every attempt to close the discussion seemed to create new curiosity. Every effort to move forward encouraged residents to look backward. Most importantly, the community was becoming less interested in narratives and more interested in verification. Then I received a phone call that stopped me in my tracks. Jason sounded more serious than I had ever heard him. According to him, a local police officer's name had unexpectedly surfaced during one of those public record inquiries. At that moment, I did not know exactly what that meant. I only knew one thing. The story was about to become much bigger than the HOA. Jason's phone call changed the direction of the entire controversy. Until that moment, most discussions inside Cedar Creek Estates revolved around memories, opinions, and competing narratives. Now a completely different possibility had entered the conversation. An actual officer who responded that day might possess information that no resident had ever seen. The realization spread quickly among the homeowners already following the situation. Suddenly, people were not asking what residents remembered. They were asking what officials documented. That distinction immediately raised the stakes. Over the next week, curiosity throughout the neighborhood intensified. Every new conversation seemed to begin with the same question. Who was the officer and what record existed? Nobody claimed to have answers. That uncertainty only fueled more speculation. Meanwhile, Stephanie continued presenting a confident public image. Community communications remained focused on positivity and neighborhood unity. Yet something had clearly changed. Residents were paying less attention to her messaging and more attention to the growing mystery surrounding the official response. Then Jason shared another detail. Through conversations with homeowners and public information requests, he learned the responding officer was Daniel Brooks. The name meant nothing to most residents. To me, however, it immediately brought back memories of that afternoon. I remembered seeing Officer Brooks arrive. I remembered speaking with him briefly. At the time, I viewed the interaction as routine. Now it suddenly felt important. Very important. Then another surprising development occurred. A homeowner who had initially supported Stephanie began asking questions publicly. During a casual gathering outside the clubhouse, she pointed out that nobody seemed interested in hearing from the people who actually responded that day. The observation resonated with several residents. For months, the community had relied almost entirely on secondhand accounts. Few people considered the possibility that objective information might exist elsewhere. The conversation that followed revealed something unexpected. Many homeowners were starting to feel uncomfortable about how quickly they accepted assumptions as facts. Then came a major shift. Karen Ellis, the resident who had made inquiries about public records, confirmed that a response had been received. She was careful not to exaggerate what it meant. She simply stated that documentation related to the incident existed and that additional information might become available through proper channels. The announcement spread through Cedar Creek Estates almost instantly. Homeowners who had ignored the controversy suddenly became interested. Those who followed it closely became intensely focused. Stephanie, however, appeared increasingly frustrated by the attention. During community interactions, she repeatedly emphasized that revisiting the past served no useful purpose. The more she pushed that message, the more residents wondered why she seemed so eager to avoid further discussion. Then I experienced a conversation that changed my perspective. Richard Bennett approached me after another community gathering and shared an observation. He believed the controversy had reached a point where the outcome no longer depended on who told the most convincing story. It depended on what information surfaced next. His comment stayed with me because it felt true. For months, narratives controlled everything. Now facts were beginning to take control. That transition was creating visible pressure throughout the neighborhood. Then came the moment that sent a wave of anticipation through Cedar Creek Estates. Jason called me again late one evening. This time he sounded excited. According to him, discussions involving official records had revealed something unexpected. Officer Brooks had been equipped with standard recording equipment during his response. Jason did not know exactly what had been captured. He did not know whether residents would ever see it. But he knew enough to understand why the possibility mattered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We both understood the significance. If objective footage existed, every assumption, every rumor, and every version of the story could be tested against reality. And for the first time since Stephanie laughed in front of that crowd, I felt certain that the truth was getting closer. The possibility of recorded footage transformed the atmosphere inside Cedar Creek Estates almost overnight. For months, residents had relied on memory, interpretation, and confidence. Now there was a chance that an objective record existed. Nobody knew exactly what it contained, but that uncertainty created a level of anticipation the neighborhood had never experienced before. Homeowners who once ignored the controversy suddenly wanted updates. Others who had strongly defended Stephanie became noticeably quieter. The conversation was no longer about whose story sounded more convincing. It was about what reality might actually show. Then something unexpected happened. The mere possibility of footage began exposing contradictions that had previously gone unnoticed. Residents started comparing stories again, but this time they approached those discussions differently. Instead of arguing over conclusions, they focused on details. Who was standing where? What was said first? When did certain comments occur? The more carefully people examined those questions, the more inconsistencies they discovered. Several homeowners realized they had accepted assumptions simply because those assumptions had been repeated often enough. That realization spread rapidly. Then Jason Reed shared another important observation. According to him, every discussion about the controversy eventually reached the same obstacle. Nobody could explain why Stephanie reacted the way she did before she fully understood the situation. The question had existed from the beginning, yet somehow it had never received serious attention. Why was she so dismissive so quickly? Why did she seem amused before most residents even knew what was happening? Those questions became increasingly difficult to ignore. Then a community gathering created another turning point. During a casual discussion outside the clubhouse, several residents began openly sharing doubts about the accepted narrative. What made the moment remarkable was not the doubts themselves. It was who expressed them. Some of the people asking questions had previously supported Stephanie. Their shift surprised everyone. They were not accusing her of anything. They simply wanted answers. The distinction mattered. Curiosity had replaced loyalty. Once that happens, narratives become much harder to control. Meanwhile, Stephanie appeared determined to project confidence. She continued attending events and speaking with homeowners as though nothing had changed. Yet residents were responding differently. Questions followed her everywhere. Conversations that once ended with her explanations now continued after she walked away. The influence she relied on for months was beginning to weaken. Then another shock arrived. Karen Ellis confirmed that efforts to obtain additional information were progressing. She remained careful with every statement, but one detail immediately captured everyone's attention. According to her, the existence of recorded material was no longer being treated as speculation. The reaction throughout the neighborhood was immediate. Conversations erupted across social media groups, community message boards, and neighborhood gatherings. People were no longer wondering whether evidence existed. They were wondering what it would reveal. That change created visible tension. Then I had a conversation with Richard Bennett that perfectly captured the moment. He told me that the controversy had reached a point where nobody could stop what was coming next. Not the HOA, not community leaders, not residents. Once objective information enters a dispute, Public opinion eventually follows wherever the facts lead. His words proved impossible to forget, because deep down, everyone seemed to sense the same thing. The story Cedar Creek Estates believed for months was standing on unstable ground. Then came the development that sent anticipation to its highest level yet. News spread that official review of the available material was moving forward. Nobody knew exactly when answers would arrive. Nobody knew exactly what would be revealed. But for the first time since that afternoon near the clubhouse, the neighborhood stood on the edge of something larger than rumor, larger than authority, and larger than assumptions. The truth was finally approaching, and many people were about to discover that they had believed the wrong story. The answers arrived on a Thursday evening, and within minutes Cedar Creek Estates stopped talking about possibilities and started confronting reality. News spread quickly that official review of the recorded material had been completed. Residents gathered in living rooms, exchanged phone calls, and filled neighborhood discussion groups with speculation. Months of rumors, assumptions, and competing stories had all led to this moment. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What actually happened that day? Then the findings began circulating. What made them so powerful was not dramatic commentary or emotional interpretation. It was the simple fact that the recording documented events exactly as they occurred. For the first time, residents were no longer relying on memory. They were relying on evidence. The impact was immediate. The footage confirmed several details that many homeowners had completely misunderstood. Most importantly, it showed the sequence of events far more clearly than anyone expected. Residents who watched the review summaries quickly noticed something that changed the entire narrative. Stephanie's dismissive attitude began much earlier than most people believed. In fact, she started making light of the situation before she possessed enough information to reasonably understand what was happening. That revelation alone sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For months, homeowners defended her actions by arguing that she accurately assessed the circumstances. The footage challenged that assumption immediately. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. The recording captured the atmosphere surrounding the incident in a way no resident memory ever could. Instead of showing widespread agreement with Stephanie's perspective, it revealed confusion among many homeowners. Several people were clearly trying to understand the situation while she continued treating it casually. That detail completely contradicted the version of events that had spread through Cedar Creek Estates. Suddenly, the confidence people remembered was no longer supported by the evidence. Then another major reversal emerged. The footage demonstrated that several comments later attributed to me were either taken out of context or remembered inaccurately. Residents who spent months believing I had escalated the situation unnecessarily were forced to reconsider their assumptions. The change in public opinion was almost instantaneous. Homeowners who once avoided conversations with me started reaching out. Others openly admitted they had reached conclusions too quickly. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Meanwhile, attention shifted towards Stephanie. For the first time since the controversy began, residents were evaluating her behavior through objective evidence rather than reputation. The difference was devastating to her credibility. Every explanation she offered over the previous months was now being compared against documented reality. The comparison was not favorable. Then came the most damaging discovery of all. The footage showed that the laughter many residents remembered was not an isolated reaction. It occurred at a point when the seriousness of the situation had not yet been fully understood. That detail became impossible for homeowners to ignore. What some people originally viewed as confidence now looked more like poor judgment. The distinction completely changed public perception. Throughout the neighborhood, conversations shifted almost overnight. Residents who once defended Stephanie were now asking difficult questions. Others wanted to know why so much effort had been spent reinforcing a narrative that the evidence did not support. The authority she relied upon for years was beginning to crumble. Then I attended another community gathering and experienced something I never expected. Homeowners who had repeated rumors about me were apologizing. Not because anyone forced them to, because the facts left little room for doubt. Months of assumptions had been overturned in a matter of days. As I stood there listening to those conversations, one realization became impossible to ignore. The footage had done more than reveal what happened. It had exposed how easily an entire community can be influenced when confidence replaces evidence. And while the truth had finally emerged, the consequences for Stephanie were only beginning. The fallout unfolded faster than anyone expected. Once residents saw how dramatically the evidence differed from the narrative they had accepted for months, confidence in Stephanie's leadership began disappearing almost immediately. What surprised me most was not the criticism directed at her. It was the number of homeowners who suddenly became interested in accountability. People who rarely attended meetings started showing up. Residents who normally avoided HOA discussions began asking detailed questions. The entire culture of Cedar Creek Estates seemed to shift within a matter of weeks. Then came the next community meeting. Attendance reached record levels. Every chair inside the clubhouse was occupied, and several homeowners stood along the walls. The atmosphere felt completely different from previous gatherings. For the first time since the controversy began, nobody seemed interested in speculation. They wanted answers. More importantly, they wanted reforms. Stephanie entered the meeting looking determined, but the room no longer responded to her authority the way it once had. Residents listened respectfully, yet every statement was followed by questions. Every explanation was compared against the evidence that had recently surfaced. The dynamic had changed completely. Then came the defining moment of the evening. A homeowner stood and asked a simple question. Why did it take objective evidence for the community to learn what actually happened? The room became silent. It was the question everyone had been thinking about. The issue was no longer the original incident. The issue was how the narrative surrounding it had been allowed to grow unchecked. Several residents followed with concerns about transparency, communication, and accountability. Others expressed frustration that questions had been discouraged instead of welcomed. Each comment revealed the same underlying truth. Trust had been damaged. Then another major development occurred. A proposal was introduced to improve community oversight and make certain records and procedures easier for homeowners to review. The suggestion received immediate support. Additional proposals followed. Residents wanted clearer communication standards. They wanted more transparency during community disputes. They wanted leadership that encouraged questions rather than avoiding them. What began as a discussion about one incident was transforming into a broader conversation about governance. The irony was impossible to miss. Stephanie spent months trying to protect her position through confidence and control. In the end, those efforts produced the exact reforms she would have preferred to avoid. Meanwhile, homeowners continued approaching me throughout the following weeks. Some apologized for believing rumors. Others admitted they never questioned the narrative because it came from someone in authority. Those conversations were surprisingly meaningful. They were not really about me. They were about lessons learned. People were recognizing how easily assumptions can become accepted facts when nobody challenges them. As for Stephanie, she remained part of the community, but her influence changed dramatically. Residents treated her with courtesy, yet the automatic trust she once enjoyed was gone. Every future decision received closer examination. Every explanation required greater detail. The authority that once seemed unshakable had been replaced by scrutiny. Looking back now, the most remarkable part of the entire story was how it began. A single moment of laughter shaped months of public opinion. That laughter encouraged assumptions, reinforced a narrative, and influenced an entire neighborhood. Yet in the end, the same incident that elevated Stephanie's confidence became the reason her credibility collapsed. The evidence did not arrive dramatically. It did not require arguments or accusations. It simply showed what happened. And once people saw the truth for themselves, everything changed. Cedar Creek Estates became a stronger community because residents learned to value facts over certainty, evidence over reputation, and accountability over authority. The story that started with mockery ended with transparency. The narrative that seemed impossible to challenge was overturned by reality. And a lesson many homeowners still talk about today is simple. Confidence can influence people for a while, but facts eventually speak louder than anyone else.